Welcome to Wednesday Stash, where I share ways to um, help you keep food for longer. And when I try to look at the camera, I always look a little askew. Um, Canning season is right here. It's coming up. You might have already prepared for those who garden. You might have already prepared to start putting your gardens in place, or you might just be looking at, you know that you're going to can this season. If that's the case, then now is the perfect time to start getting all of your materials ready for canning season. So I'm going to go over what do you need in order to prepare for canning season. So first, we're going to start off with decide, what do you plan on canning? What are some things that you would like to can? Even if you don't have any concrete plans yet, you just know that you want to can. Well, what are some of the things that you would like to can? Once you've decided upon that, then the first place you should start is with tested recipes. So what a tested recipe is going to do for you is it's going to give you all of the information that you need in order to can food that will be safe and of high quality. And you want both of those. You want the food to be safe, and you want it to be something that you would like to eat. So I'm going to show you some really great resources for tested recipes. There are you've got quite a good selection for a tested recipe. And I'll go over why you want a tested recipe, but here are some of the sources. So one of my favorite, So Easy to Preserve. This is put out by the University of Georgia Extension, and it's comprehensive, it's easy to use, lots of neat recipes, and if you go to the UGA site, University of Georgia site, and you just put in, canning resource or So Easy to Preserve, it will direct you to where you can purchase this guide. I think it's about $20. I think the last that I heard, it's about $20. And so this would be a good resource. This is one that people are familiar with, the Ball Blue Book, Guide to Preserving. So this is another tested recipe. You want to take a look and see if there are recipes in here that you would like to use. But if you don't want to purchase anything and you have access to a printer, you have, you can print things off, or you could just go to it. I'm going to give you two, or if you have a computer, I'm going to give you two resources. So this one you can print completely off. This is the USDA Guide to Home Canning. You can access this at a site that I'm going to show you right here at the National Center for Home Food Preservation. So, like I said, there are two sites. You can come to National Center for Home Food Preservation. You can hit that little search button and stick in, click in what would you like to can, and you can get it right there online. Or if you would like to, if you'd like to print something, you can also get this guide at this site. So National Center for Home Food Preservation. And I was hoping that the URL would come up. I'll drop the URL for this in the comment section so that you can have that. But National Center for Home Food Preservation is an excellent resource. And like I said, the USDA. This is only Guide 1, Principles of Home Canning, but there are 7. It's either 7 or 8. And it goes through well, I'm looking at it right now. Actually, there's 6 plus the center. So there's 7 where you can go through, and you can, it can give you the information and resources that you need for canning, starting with that tested recipe. So you want to avoid recipes that have not been tested, because you don't know whether or not, one, if it's safe to can that product. There's been some things in the news where there was a recommendation by, like a food authority, so to speak, and the recommendation was for food that was not safe for boiling water canning, and that was the recommendation that was given. So sometimes people, you think this would work, or if it's a good idea, and it might not be a good idea, it might not work, or it might be something that just really does not give you a quality product if you can it. So you use a tested recipe so that you could have those bases covered. And if you have a recipe and you're wondering, hey, I would really like to use this recipe, find the tested recipe from one of the sites authorities. I left one out that I wanted to add, your cooperative extension site. So you can go in, search a recipe, put in cooperative extension, and if you have tested recipes coming from your state cooperative extension, those recipes are tested as well. You can use those. But like I said, if you have a recipe and you want to know, hey, can I use this? Can I can this particular food? Find a tested recipe and see how it matches up. If it doesn't match up, find one as close to what it is that you would like to can, and use that, so that this way that it's safe and of high quality. Now, if there's something you want to can and you're not finding any information on canning it at all, none. I mean, you've looked through tested recipe resource guides, you've gone to the National Center for Home Food Preservation, you have gone through extension sites, and you cannot find anything on canning this food, there's probably a reason why. It's either not safe, or you're not going to get a quality product. So you don't want to can it. But there are other food preservation methods. I spoke about that last week, what your choices are. You don't have to stick just with canning. You can freeze, you can dry, you can ferment, you can pickle. There are different things that you can do with foods if you want to preserve those foods. So I know I'm beating the drum on this tested recipe, but it really is important. So next we're going to move on. We're going to take a look at, let's see, processing method. Okay, so you have your testing, you know what you want to can. You have your tested recipe. Okay, so your tested recipe is going to tell you your processing method. So for your processing method, you will know whether or not you need to use a pressure canner, whether or not it is safe for boiling water canning. That's all going to be in your tested recipe. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at processing methods. All right. So I just need to get over to that side of the kitchen. Make sure you can still hear me. And all right. So we're going to look at pressure canners first. So I didn't pull out the whole canner because it's so tall that you would not be able, you're not going to be able to see. It'll be out of the range of the canner. So for the pressure canner, of course, with the pressure canner, you're going to have a pot. This isn't a pressure canner pot, but you're going to have the pot that goes with this canner. So it's going to be made up of the pot, the lid. This is going to be the lid, the gauge. So your pressure canner is either going to be a dial gauge, like you see right here. We have a dial gauge right here. Or it's going to be a weighted gauge, like you see here. Now, with this particular canner, it has both. Yes, I can see that both of them are here, but for this type of canner, you always go by the weight. That's what this is for, added assurance. But if this is the only type of gauge that your canner has, this is what you go by. You're going to go by the dial gauge. Okay? So you want to, you're going to have your, like I said, you're going to have your pot, you're going to have your lid, you're going to have your gauge. Some canners have gaskets. This particular canner does not. It's not designed to have a gasket. But if you had a gasket, it's going to fit. Your gasket's going to fit. You can tell I just dropped my gauge. Your gasket's going to fit in this side, on this side. And with your gasket, you want to make sure that it's in good condition. You want to make sure that you're following the manufacturer's instructions. If the instructions say to oil the gasket, you oil it. If the instructions just say do not oil the gasket, of course, don't oil it. But you want to take care of that gasket and make sure that it's in good condition, so that your canner work properly. Also with the canner, you're going to have a rack. So this isn't the rack. I'm going to just show you. This canner has a rack inside. This pot will also have a rack. This particular canner will have a rack as well, and the rack will keep the jars from the bottom of the canner. You do not want jars resting in the bottom of your canner for two purposes. One, you don't want to crack your jars, from the heat on the bottom of the canner. But the other part of canning, there has to be circulation of water around, on the sides of your jar, beneath your jar, and the rack allows for that proper circulation of water. So make sure that you have a rack as well. And some canners have regulators. So for if it's a dial gauge, your dial gauge is going to serve as your regular. If it's a weighted gauge, your weight's going to serve as your regulator. But if you have a dial gauge, there's often another piece, that's here for regulating the pressure. So it's going to depend on your canner whether you have that or not. But you want to make sure that all of your parts are in good working condition. And if you have a gauge only canner, that's what's measuring your pressure, you want to have this tested. Okay, you need to have it tested every single year. Many cooperative extension offices offer this service, but if you have a gauge that cannot be tested at the local office, you might have to send it to the manufacturer. So it's a good idea to find out all of this before you start canning season. You don't want to, start getting into the midst of things and find out your dial gauge isn't working properly. Okay, so go ahead and get all of that done first. Now, with this type of canner, like I said, you go by the weight. The weight doesn't have to be tested. And then this is a backup. So for this particular canner, if I'm canning at 10 pounds 10 pounds of pressure, but my dial gauge is reading something really crazy over here, I'm going to have this replaced. Because, like I said, it's added assurance, but it's really nice where, I can count my time as soon as this starts moving, and that's what you're going to do once your weighted gauge starts jiggling. With mine, as soon as this starts jiggling, this is indicating the amount of weight that I have set over here. So I just, it really is nice for the added assurance, but you don't have to have this. You don't have to have both parts. If you follow the directions for your dial gauge, read your manufacturer's instructions always, and you follow the instructions, you can be assured that you're doing things properly. It's the same thing. You're weighted, and even not all weighted gauges look like this. This particular one has the 5, the 10, the 15, where you just turn it to the weight that you want to can at. You might have some that look like little rings, where you put the rings on top. So if it's just the weight by itself without rings, that's 5. You add another ring, that's 10. You add another ring, that's 15. All of these canners have been tested to use for pressure canning foods. They all work, but you want to follow your manufacturer's instructions. I also would like to add for the dial gauge. You always add 1 pound. So if you are somewhere where it says to can at 10 pounds of pressure, if you're using a dial gauge, you add 1 pound. So you're going to can at 11 pounds of pressure. Now, that information again is going to be in your tested recipe to tell you exactly how many pounds of pressure you should be canning at. And then also, if you need to make altitude adjustments, if you're at higher than 1,000 foot, then you have to make some adjustments to the weight of your canner. So if you're using a dial gauge and it says, okay, you're going to can at 10, well, for this it's going to be 11, but you're over 1,000 foot, you're going to go 2,000 foot for this, you're going to go to 12. Your tested recipe will have you adjust for altitude. Now, if you do not know the altitude of where you reside, you can look that up online, or you can call your local cooperative extension service, and they will tell you what your altitude is as well. And then this way you know, okay, am I canning at the proper pressure? Now, that's what's nice about the dial gauges, because you can make those minute type of adjustments. If you have a weighted only gauge, your only choices are 5, 10, 15. So if you have a recipe that says to can at 10 pounds of pressure and you're above the altitude, you need your only choice is to switch to 15 pounds of pressure. You can't make the minute adjustments, you can't per pound adjustments the way you can with the dial gauge. So these both have benefits. A lot of people find the weighted gauge a whole lot easier to use, but again, they have benefits. You have to decide which one you like the most. Okay, so with your pressure canners, make sure if you have a dial gauge, go ahead and get it tested. Have all of your parts inspected, look at them and make sure. And even if you purchase a brand new canner, brand new, right out of the box, you still want to go ahead and get that dial gauge tested. Things happen, okay? So even if it's brand new. And then read the instructions, because sometimes you could buy a brand new canner. It's not completely put together. There might be pieces that you have to assemble. So you want the schematic in your directions so that you know that you're assembling your canner correctly. So make sure you follow those directions. And if you have a canner, maybe you're gifted, you picked up somehow, you come across the canner, maybe you have the canner and realize you have a canner and you realize, I've never read the directions before. Look them up. It would be a really good idea to get a copy of those directions and look at them and find out, have you been using your canner properly? So that's your pressure canner. Now, boiling water canner. Okay. Oh, pressure canner, I'll point out, the times that you need to use a pressure canner is when you're canning low acid foods, vegetables, meat, poultry, fish, tomatoes, or combinations of these foods. That's what goes into a pressure canner. Again, like I said, it's going to be in your tested recipe. Now, a boiling water canner. Boiling water canner works for your higher acid and acidified foods. Okay, so your fruits, pickles, relishes, jams, jellies, preserves, those types of foods can be canned in the boiling water canner. So again, it's made up of a pot, a close-fitting lid, and a rack. For the same reason, you do not want those jars on the bottom of the canner. And because you want to make sure that you have proper circulation, you want to avoid jar breakage. Dishcloths are not going to work. Sometimes people I know have put like dishcloths or washcloths in the bottom of the pot, but that's not going to ensure the proper circulation, because you want to make sure your jars have all reached the proper processing temperature. So, and with boiling water canning, not only must the jars be on the rack, but the pot must be deep enough. You got to have a pot that's deep enough so that if you do put a jar in this pot, that 1 to 2 inches of water will go over the jar. So this rack is not all the way down. Push it down. There we go. And you can have 1 to 2 inches of water over your jar. Okay? Now, you don't do that with pressure canning. Pressure canning, your jars are immersed in the water about a third of the, about 1/3 water going up the side of the jar, because you're canning in a steam environment with a pressure canner. For the boiling water canner, it's the water. You need the water to completely encircle the jar. If you have not any pot that's deep enough for this purpose, will serve. If you have a pot that has a lid, because you do not can without a lid, all recipes, all tested recipes, the processing is designed that you have canned with the lid in place. Okay, so as long as if you have any pot that is big enough for your jars to fit in, to be covered by 1 inch of water, It has a rack. If you don't have, the pot did not come with the rack, you can purchase, this is one. This particular one, to be honest, it drives me a little crazy because it can flip up on you. But this can be placed on the bottom of the pot. Put this here. Place this in the bottom of the pot, and in the bottom of the pot, your jars are going to go on that. That will serve the pot purpose also. But then there are also replacement racks for your canners as well. So you can get something like this, or you can get a replacement rack. But again, you just don't want those jars on the bottom. So if you have the pot, you have a rack, you have a close-fitting lid, that's a boiling water canner. Okay, so that will work also. You don't have to buy a special one. I'll be honest, I cheated with this one. This serves the purpose. This is not a traditional canner. This is a tamale pot. It's just that this does not take up the footprint on my stove that a traditional canner does. Traditional canners are usually so big. This one suits my purposes. The jars fit. They're covered by 1 to 2 inches of water. It has a rack. I can can in it. Okay? So that's why I use this one. Now, the processing time in the canner, like I said, it's built into the recipe. So for your pressure canner, part of the processing time is once the processing is over, you just turn the canner, you turn the heat off. You walk away and you leave it alone until the pressure drops to 0 on its own. Then you remove the jars and put them on the cushion surface, and you let them finish processing. The jars take approximately 12 to 24 hours in order for them to seal. For a boiling water canner, as soon as your time is up, you remove the jars and you put them in the cushion, on the cushion surface, and you let those cool off. That's part of your processing time. Okay, so that's why I said you need to read your instructions so that you know how to use your equipment properly. For your pressure canner, before you ever even start canning, you always vent your canner for 10 minutes. That means you have to take either if it's a weighted gauge, you're going to take that weight off, or if it's a dial gauge only, you want to take that regulator off. And when you get a strong column of steam, you're going to let it vent for 10 minutes. You're going to let that column of steam, blow for 10 minutes so that you drive air out of the jar. Again, that's a part of the processing. So you want to, part of following your tested recipe is to follow those make sure you have all of your processing going. All right, so we've gone over equipment. For your canning equipment, whether you're going to boiling water can or if you're going to pressure can. Now let's start looking at some other things like your jars and lids. Your jars and lids are important too. So what you want to use is a canning jar. Okay? So for your canning jars, they're designed to handle the rigors of home canning. So they were designed, I have different ones here. Oh, I was just going to show you. Okay, that's a regular mouth. That's a wide mouth. These are both quarts. That's a regular mouth. That's a wide mouth. These are both pints. Okay, so for these jars, these are the types that are recommended. And you'll notice on the rims, the lids of the top parts of the jars, they're flat. And commercial jars might be beveled because they're sealed differently than the way that you're going to seal jars at home. Okay, and these were designed for specific use, and we're going to get to that when we get to lids. But for right now, you want to make sure with your canning jars that they're in good condition. So you're going to inspect your jars. You're going to look and see, are there any scratches? Are there any cracks? Are there any chips around, on your lid? And that's important because if you have any defects, such as cracks, chips, scratches, those are weak points. So for those weak points, that if this jar is stressed enough, it could break. during the processing. The temperature is high. There's food in the jar. It's in boiling water, or it's being canned under pressure. That's a lot of stress on the jar. That's why you want to make sure that you have jars in good condition, and that they do not have stress points. So if you have any defects in your jars, those are jars that you do not want to use. Discard. Don't use those for canning. You might have other purposes, but you don't want to use them for canning. This is another reason why you do not use metal in your jars. Do not, when you're, we're going to talk about some other special equipment, but when you're checking for air bubbles and you're running for air bubbles, don't use knives, don't use metal spoons, don't use any metal at all, because that can cause scratches. Scratches can cause weak points. So you're going to use things like a rubber spatula or ladle, plastic spoon, plastic knife. If you have a headspace measurer that's made out of plastic, and the other end of it is usually for running your wand bubble, making sure. But never use metal in your jars. You want to protect and take care of those jars. And okay, so we've gone over that. I wanted to go over why the lid, the brim of the canning jars is designed the way it is, and that's so it can take the only recommended type of lids for canning that there are. And the recommended lid is the two-piece metal system. So that's made up of a metal, I believe it's tin, lid. It has an enameled surface on this side, but then it also has a sealing compound on this side. And then there's the metal band that goes with it. So during canning, what happens is you have that flat lid. Once you've filled your jar and you have to clean the top to make sure that there's nothing coming between the brim of the jar and the sealing compound. So once that goes on and you've finger tightened, you're only going to go finger tight with that lid. Once you've done that, during processing, what happens is that sealing compound, it's going to soften from the heat. Okay? It's going to soften. And during the softening, it fits over this lid, it fits over the brim, and when processing is completed and it starts to cool, this starts to harden. And as it hardens, that's where you're going to form your seal, because during processing, the oxygen in the jar is being driven out of the jar. So once the jar starts cooling, this seals because you don't want it to return to the jar. That's why your food is preserved, because you've pushed out the oxygen and it's not in the jar. You're not going to allow it to return, because you don't want to give opportunity to any microbes inside that want to grow. Okay, they want to, they need that oxygen. So that's why you're preserving. Okay, with this particular band, when you use it, and it's only one, this you use one time, this you can use multiple times. Because during that process, when this softens and hardens, you have an indentation. Now, some people use their bands. They try to get multiple uses out of the band. You're left at a high risk for seal failure, and that's because, again, you might have an indentation in your band. During process, you might have lost some of your sealing compound when you've ready to use the contents of the jar and you've pulled the lid off of the jar. You might have sealing compound left on the rim of your jar that's not here. They're just not designed for multiple uses. So this you use one time. These you're going to use multiple times. When you're finished canning and it's processed, you have a seal, your everything is good to go. You're going to remove this band. Wipe off your jar just in case there's any food residue or anything on the outside of the jar. Mold can grow on that. You always want to wipe off, make sure your jars are clean, and store these in a cool, dark, and dry place. These, you're going to go ahead and wash them, dry them, and put them away. And you can use them multiple times as long as there's no rust. They're not rusted inside. They're not dented. As long as they're in good condition, you get plenty of life out of your bands. Okay? So that's your recommended. I meant to grab, I had a sample of the plastic ones that people use, that are supposed to be reusable. And the only reason we don't recommend them is because we don't have enough research on, how many times you can use them, how strong a seal, what's the shelf life on the food. It's just that we don't have those type of answers for those questions. So that's why we don't recommend the reusable ones. Right now, currently, this is it. This is what we have as the recommended lid for your canning jars. Okay, so I've gone over the essentials, which you must have for canning. But there's some other things that make canning easier, and I wouldn't want to can without them. Okay, so just for safety, oven mitts are wonderful. These jars are hot. They can be hot when you're filling your jars. You might need to move your pot. You might have to move your canner. Oven mitts are good to protect your hands, so you want to have those on hand. The funnels are wonderful for filling your jars. It makes it so much easier to fill a jar with a funnel rather than using. Oh, I have to grab my ladle. Well, I think my ladle's in the dishwasher, so I'm going to use it. Oh, well, big spoons are good, excellent also. But it's a lot easier to fill these jars with the ladle, with the spoon, and get the food channeled into the jar, rather than trying to fill your jars and you might have food, going, all over the place. So this is really neat to have. This is a jar lifter. So once your jars are filled and you're ready to put them into the pot, okay, this is wonderful to lift those jars up and get them into the pot without using your hands and without potentially, because you're worried about burning your hands in the water, which you should be, you're getting the jars, like say maybe this far, up to the band, just before your fingers, and you're dropping the jar into the pot because you don't want to get burned. This is an excellent way to get those jars into the pot, and excellent way to get the jars back out when processing is finished. So jar lifter is nice. Spoons, ladles. You want to have plenty of dishcloths on hand so that when you're ready to when you're ready to allow your jars to cool, you want to cool them on a cushioned surface. You want to avoid shock to the jar from the contents of the jar, and the jar itself are so hot, and you put it on a cool surface. Again, that can cause jar breakage. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have that on a cushioned surface. So that's where dish towels come in really handy as far as cleaning up. Dishcloths to wipe off the rims after you've filled your jars. You want to go ahead and make sure those rims are white so that you don't have anything between that sealing compound and the brim of the jar. Okay, so I don't have a headspace measurer. That's another excellent device, because your tested recipe is going to tell you exactly how much headspace to leave in that jar. And that's going to be dependent on your recipe. Some recipes, like your jams, your jellies, 1/4 of an inch of headspace. You don't have to leave a lot of headspace because those type of foods don't really expand during processing. They need a little wiggle room during processing, but they don't really expand, so you don't have to leave very much space. And your recipe is based on 1/4 of an inch of oxygen being in that jar. Now, some recipes you need 1/2 an inch of headspace. Other recipes you might need 1 inch of headspace. So that's where those headspace measurers come in really handy, because you want a part of your tested recipe. Don't skip anything. You're not going to skip measuring the proper amount of headspace. So you want to know how much food is in that jar. So that's another critical tool that you want to have. You don't want to process food and you only have food this far, you've got a tested recipe that, you know, says leave an inch of headspace, and you've got 2 inches of headspace in your jar. And there's a few things that could happen with that, where you've got too much air, so it's not processed properly. You could have oxidation that's going on, so the top of your food doesn't look right. You know, there's just too much air in the jar. It could be prone to spoilage. There's different things that could happen if you're leaving too much headspace in the jar. So go ahead, follow that tested recipe, and make sure that you are you're doing things the way that you should be. So I want to make sure I'm not blocking the camera. Okay, so start gathering those canning supplies now, getting things ready. If you need your dog gauge tested, go ahead and get it tested. Now's the time to prepare for canning season. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments. I'll drop the National Center for Home Food Preservation's URL in there if you don't already have it. But that'll be in there. So that's it for this week's Wednesday Stash, where I share ways to help you keep your food for longer. And please join me next week. I'm going to talk to you about canning methods that are not recommended. There's some interesting practices out there, so we're going to go over why they're not recommended. We've given you you have the recommended canning practices now, where you're going to use a tested recipe, and you're going to follow that recipe, whether you're going to boiling water can or if you're going to pressure can. But we're going to talk about some of the things that practices that you shouldn't do and why. It's not just arbitrary. Why shouldn't you do it? But again, that's it for this week's Wednesday Stash. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it, and take care for now. Bye.